Get started. If I haven't met some of you, there's a quick question here and I'll respond to that in a moment. So welcome to the webinar, Reflecting on Whiteness, Lessons from a Pilot Program to Expand Our Capacity to Work with Race. I'm Alexis Bucknam. I'm the Executive Director of Utah Campus Compact, and on behalf of California and the Mountain West Compacts, we thank you for participating today. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to use the Zoom platform so that you are familiar with that before we turn the stage over to our distinguished speakers today. So just a couple of logistical pieces. If you are not a panelist, you do not need to mute your platform. If you are and you're not speaking, we would recommend that. In order to communicate with us, you can either use the chat, which I would recommend for kind of more general inquiries about sound, etc., or there's the Q&A, which is there at the bottom in the toolbar. Both of those are. The Q&A is going to be an opportunity for you to type in any questions specific to the content of the webinar, and we'll be monitoring that, both the presenters and a couple of people from Campus Compact, so we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. We know that we have a wonderful webinar and a lot of content to cover, so I'm not going to take any more of your time. But if you have questions, again, feel free to type them into the chat and we will respond to those specific to using the platform, or questions related to the content you can place in the Q&A, which is there at the bottom. And we all have access to be able to read that. So with that, we'll move on to turning the time over to our distinguished presenters, Karen Cotterman and Michelle Montagno, who are both from the University of San Francisco. I can speak from experience of attending a pre-conference at the International Association for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement that they have a lot of wonderful information to share, and we're delighted that they've agreed to speak with us today. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and turn the time over to Karen and Michelle.
Thanks, Alexis.
Thank you. Thanks, Alexis, and thank you to Compact for the invitation to participate in this webinar, and I really appreciate all the support and planning that's gone into it. And I also will mention at the end of this webinar, but I want to mention we will be doing also a pre-conference in Denver in spring, so we can get you more information on that. But I want to say that before I get caught up in the content here. And I'll say a little bit as a means to introduce myself, and then ask Michelle to introduce herself as well. So greetings from San Francisco. I'm the director of Engage San Francisco, a campus community partnership between the University of San Francisco and the Western Addition neighborhood. I've been here at USF for 7 years. I've been in the field of service learning, I would say formally, since 1998, and I've taught at a variety of places, including Monterey Bay and the Haas Center at Stanford. And I wanted to say a little bit specifically about my journey regarding whiteness. In particular, that began as I was an undergraduate at California State University in Northridge, when I was attending school there, and the verdict that acquitted the police officers that had been videotaped beating Rodney King came out. And I literally was in a class called Minorities in the Media that night, and the professor stopped class and announced, "We're leaving class early. I want everybody to go directly home." And then an uprising took place that lasted 6 days in Los Angeles, and it shut down our university for that entire period of time. So being an undergraduate paraprofessional, that allowed me to engage in a lot of conversations around identity and understanding why folks were reacting to this verdict in that way. Again, this was in 1992. And that's certainly, that tension is something that's being referred to a lot these days with the current climate in this country. So this is just part of my entire journey and process that I'm still engaging in, and I plan on being engaged in understanding my whiteness for hopefully another 40 years. So I'm grateful to share this moment in my understanding with you. Michelle?
Thanks, Karen. My name is Michelle Montagno, and I am the director of the doctoral program in clinical psychology here at the University of San Francisco. My research interests are around white racial identity development and teaching both clinicians and lay people as well around whiteness, white privilege, racism. I have been working since 2009, thinking about my own journey with whiteness. Really started for me when I was in graduate school, when I was becoming a psychologist myself and becoming more and more aware of inequities and seeing it in my work with clients. Then in 2009, I began working with the Untraining, which is an organization in the East Bay, Untraining Personal and Social Oppressions. And I'm now on the teaching team for Untraining White Liberal Racism. So we'll tell you more about the Untraining as well, as they were foundational in terms of our developing this project.
So I'm looking at paper, just to be transparent. Since I'm clicking through slides, I'll also be flipping paper over here. So we've set some goals for what we're going to explore today. One is why internal work is necessary for white identified practitioners and faculty who are engaged with community. What barriers we run to that impede our ability to engage in ally behaviors. We'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about the content of the seminar that we co-facilitated, and which strategies we can use to develop our capacity to talk about race. And again, we'll draw examples from our Reflecting on Whiteness series that we co-facilitated last fall in 2015 here at USF. And I want to say a little bit about why internal work is necessary for white identified practitioners. And I'll be able to elaborate on that soon. But first, a little bit about the institutional context at University of San Francisco. We all have our own institutional context. Not unlike other institutions, we have a predominantly white faculty and staff. I mean, that's the truth in higher ed, largely. Broad generalization, but largely true. However, here at USF, we have a student population that is majority students of color. We have just over 30% students who are white identified, and that's including undergraduate as well as graduate students. And that's just over 10,000 students at USF. We want to certainly recognize that it was through a partnership with the Office of Diversity Engagement and Community Outreach, the DECO office, here at USF, that we offered and facilitated this workshop last fall. They did the heavy lifting on some of the organizing, the recruitment, the application process, the logistics that we're going to get into a little bit when we talk about how we were able to offer this campus-wide. We also want to mention that there was a campaign called the Check Your Privilege campaign. It received a little bit of national coverage. That was put together by Professor Janina Walker as well as some of her colleagues from across campus. It was an interdisciplinary program, and that really was around heightening the awareness of undergraduate students around different types of identities and how we carry privileges around those identities. There was posters around campus and then t-shirts and some events. So that took place in 2014, the year before we offered this. And then I also want to mention that Professor Rhonda McGee has written a wonderful article called On the Way of Color Insight. She's doing a lot of work within the School of Law to help folks understand color insight rather than color blindness. So she has a publication that's available now. It's coming out in the Georgetown Law Review. And she is also a certified mindfulness-based stress reduction instructor. And so she has some similar approaches in how she's approaching race and racism and awareness of racial bias and how it plays out, in particular in the legal profession and contemplative practice and how those two things can work together. And then in fall, just shortly after we completed our Reflecting on Whiteness series, the BSU on campus here published a list of student demands. And of course, you can see those at the website that's called thedemands.org, where there are, actually, I don't even know how many universities have BSU demands listed on that website, but it's dozens and dozens and dozens of BSUs from across the country, and USF is included in that. And then also in fall, just after we finished our Reflecting on Whiteness series, Associated Students published a Stand Against Microaggressions resolution. And again, it's not it's not in any way a result of our Reflecting on Whiteness seminar, but it's something that we became aware of during the course of the seminar when conversations would turn to, in particular, how do we support students of color at USF? And those are examples from this microcosm that is USF, but we highlight those because everyone has an institutional context, and some of those actually parallel these examples at different universities from where you might be. And also, I'm also making the assumption, since this is a compact event, that many of you actually work at universities, and so I want to apologize in advance for being so university-centric if there are community partners or students who may not be approaching this as a faculty or staff person in some of my presenting, but I'll try to check that. But I just want to name that that's my positionality will probably be my default. So again, we have key partners here at USF. The DECO office, as we mentioned, again, that's Dr. Mary Wardell Giraduzzi is the Chief Diversity Officer for the University of San Francisco. Her program manager, Ria Dasgupta, was again key in all of the logistics that were involved in this series. We received a Jesuit Foundation grant to help fund the research that took place, in particular this summer. And then the McCarthy Center, where I work, and the School of Nursing and Health Professions. Michelle, do you have anything to add to that slide?
No, just to highlight the tremendous amount of institutional support we had and how much that impacted our ability to succeed with this pilot.
Thanks. So I would like to say a little bit about why whiteness and campus community work. I've included an excerpt from Dr. Tania Mitchell, who is at University of Minnesota, some of the questions that she posed in her Linton Colloquium talk. And then I have a couple other things that are informing certainly my approach to entering into this work. And my hope is that this will resonate with some of my colleagues in the field. So Dr. Mitchell presents how do we talk about structures of inclusion in community engaged scholarship without talking about the structures that exclude. How do we have these conversations without being honest about the discrimination, the exploitation, the oppression, and the inequality that are so very fundamental to the social issues we are concerned with? How do we talk about or develop strategies for more inclusive community engagement practice without naming and addressing the barriers to community engagement that exist? Again, I think this relates to how do we as practitioners or as faculty or as students have the capacity to engage in conversations around inclusion and exclusion, particularly when it comes to issues related to race. And again, citing again Dr. Mitchell in her AAC&U Diversity and Democracy essay that came out, I believe it was last year. It was entitled Identity and Social Action, the Role of Self-Examination and Systemic Change. Again, she talks about the need to facilitate conversations about identity in the classroom, in particular in service learning classes. And again, that takes skill, it takes practice, and it takes the ability to sit with uncomfortable conversations or difficult dialogues, in my opinion, in my experience. And then also, I want to name that Butin, as well as Mitchell and Donahue together, have talked about service learning as a pedagogy for whiteness, or pedagogy of whiteness, and that service learning can serve as a tool for white normativity. And I think that we have to have the ability to interrogate that within the field and interrogate that individually. And again, that requires the individual capacity to explore this and hold multiple realities simultaneously, that we may have good intentions, and that we also simultaneously need to explore, are we actually normalizing or centering whiteness through our work? And those can be uncomfortable conversations, but necessary ones, I think, within the field. So a little bit about how we got started. So prior to offering the Reflecting on Whiteness dialogue series, as Michelle mentioned, we met through the untraining. While we never participated in the untraining at the same time, we had a mutual friend, many of you probably know, Dr. Kathleen Rice, and she said, you're both at University of San Francisco, you should get to know each other. So we met and we started talking about and sort of hatching this idea, what if we had a dialogue series here at USF, and kicking around that idea for a period of time. Then we informally convened a group of white faculty and staff who were doing anti-racist work on and off campus to have an informal conversation. We just offered to host it just so folks could really meet each other and build community. So we're talking about folks from all parts of the university, program staff, folks from the library, folks from different academic departments and schools. And then we engaged in conversations with Vice Provost Wardell Giraduzzi and created a proposal. Then we reached out to faculty and staff we thought would be interested. Some of those were the individuals that we had met with that first informal conversation. Some of them were folks that we had just come to know through our relationships on campus. Some of them were folks that the Vice Provost had in mind. And so some of that was just an informal network where our initial outreach and promotion took place. But then the Diversity Engagement and Community Outreach Office promoted the series. They put it in their newsletter. There was work on drafting flyers, and they also facilitated an online application. We assisted with the creation of some application questions, and then they sent that out and coordinated that information so that we could take a look at it. And then we selected the participants. The group was intentionally capped at 10, with Michelle and I as the facilitators of the group, making it 12. And so we had 10 participants, again, from all parts of campus, all types of positions, program assistants, full professors, folks in administration. So it was a very mixed group. Anything you want to add, Michelle, that I might have overlooked? So, Michelle, maybe you could say a little bit about the pilot project.
Yes. So we thought we would start by telling you a little bit about the format of the dialogue series. So we met over a 6-week period of time in fall 2015, and each session was 3 hours. As Karen mentioned, we had 10 participants and 2 facilitators. And again, the Vice Provost of the Diversity Engagement Office came to both the first and the last session. So I really can't stress enough how important it was to have her support and for her lending the institutional credibility to this project we wanted to do. We fed participants dinner, and then we engaged in a variety of different types of exercises around the topics that we had planned in our syllabus. So that included group discussion, dyad and triad activities, multimedia resources, different types of experiential learning, and we also had readings. So we did recommended readings. You know, given the amount of stress on faculty and staff, which is similar to any institution, we didn't require a lot of reading. We typically picked one article per week, and it was a recommended article, and then we used that as part of our work in the session. We also had a resource page on our online learning platform. We used Canvas, so we kept a running list of various articles and resources for the participants to reference. In the development of our syllabus, the main resources that we used included untraining materials, and the website is there, untraining.org. We also heavily relied on Judith Katz's 2003 book on white awareness, the handbook for anti-racism training, as well as D'Angelo's work on white fragility. So moving on to talk about the model that we created. So we wanted to cover a number of topics. So we wanted to talk about racism and white privilege, how that shows up in a university setting, as well as in individuals. We also wanted to talk about white racial identity development and unlearning social conditioning, the use of contemplative practice to build the capacity to do this work, and the importance of building community as a means to develop structures of inclusion. So these were the 4 pillars of the pilot model that we developed. And in addition to that, each session that we conducted, we thought about in terms of what's called the tripartite model. And this comes from the work of Sue Arredondo and McDavis from 1992. And it's typically used to describe cultural competence training in clinicians. But their belief is that in order to continue to build and develop our own capacity to be culturally competent practitioners, we need to increase our awareness, our ability to notice what's happening around us, what's happening within us. We also need to increase our knowledge. So this is the factual, intellectual-based information. And then the skills. And so what are the skills related to these topics around unlearning white social conditioning, using contemplative practice? So we really tried to apply that tripartite model lens to each of our sessions with our participants. So we're going to break down each of the different topics now, just to give you a bit of a sense of what we focused on. So here we are, building knowledge and awareness about racism and white privilege. So thinking about the knowledge piece, we included discussion on the kinds and levels of racism. So thinking about both in terms of individual, and that's interpersonal, in relationship with others, as well as what's internalized. So thinking about the internalized racist stereotypes that we all learn as a function of existing in this society. And then focus especially on systemic racism and looking at institutional and structural racism. So institutional both within our university here at USF, as well as structural, which is across institutions. So how racism shows up in these places. And we typically lack awareness and knowledge about those systemic pieces. So we really focused on that. And one way we did that was an exercise on institutional racism. It's called the Institutional Racism Web, and you can find this in the Katz book. And basically, it's exactly what it sounds like. We basically took a whiteboard and mapped out all the places where white privilege and racism show up in our own institution. And it wasn't to overly critique the University of San Francisco when we made it clear, you know, we're using this as our model because it's what we're familiar with. And these same types of issues exist across different universities. So the second component of the dialogue series is about building knowledge and awareness around white racial identity development. So what does this mean? Not everybody is familiar with this topic. And there's a descriptive model of white racial identity development that was developed by Sue and Sue, and these are clinical psychologists. And the idea is that we wanted to teach our participants about this to give them grounding, both background knowledge and the ability to start becoming more aware of where they are in their own identity process. Because again, these aren't the types of things that we learn in our traditional education. So the concept briefly around white racial identity development is that it's a process that happens throughout one's lifetime. And there's racial identity development for people of color as well. And these identity development processes are largely unconscious. So we describe the journey from the early stages, and this is known as conformity, where white people have minimal awareness of themselves as racial beings, where, you know, we might identify as colorblind or deny that racism exists. And then through the stages of this process, if one continues to move through and learn and grow, the person ends up coming face to face with the realities of racism and the impacts of white privilege. And again, the model continues on. So it's important both to highlight for participants, you know, where are you in this model? Are you someone who's in the early stages? Are you someone somewhere in the middle? Are you someone who's moving toward developing a more integrated awareness? Have you moved into what they title an introspection phase, where you are moving toward a non-racist or anti-racist identity? And, you know, identity development models are complicated, they're nuanced, they're not linear. And again, this is often a largely unconscious process. So what we were trying to do was make this a bit conscious so people could realize, oh, I can see myself in this place. And from my perspective, it's hopeful information that one can continue to move through. So what underlies the development of a racial identity process in a white person is this concept of white social conditioning. And, you know, that is loosely defined as the process by which we learn how to be white. The stories that we're told by family, by media, by educational institutions, all of the stories that are presented to us that really contribute to upholding, the white supremacist values in this country. So we're part of this process of social conditioning that happens is developing defense mechanisms, right? Because as we're growing and learning all of this information, we have to figure out how to deal with conflicting realities. Because as people are telling us, okay, racism is a thing of the past, for instance, racism is a thing of the past, and then I see a racist incident, how do I navigate that in my mind? So over the course of centuries, as white folks have, continued to pass on this social conditioning, these defense mechanisms, such as denial, defensiveness, compartmentalization, are developed to help us deal with the conflicting information. So the one other piece that I want to add about this is D'Angelo's work around white fragility. All of this is really important to understanding what we were trying to do with this dialogue series. So white fragility, according to D'Angelo, is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. And she talks about these defensive moves in the context of particularly about talking about race, and particularly in cross-racial conversations. That what can happen, so we've got both the defense mechanisms going on in white people, and these are defense mechanisms that have been passed down generation after generation. So we've got defense mechanisms to deal with. There's also this concept of white fragility. So we haven't had very much time or practice or experience with talking about this. And it's a charged situation. So D'Angelo talks about what happens in these defensive moves as emotional, behavioral, and intellectual. And so emotional, this is how we might react in a situation where race comes up. So emotional would be anger, shame, guilt, fear. Those might be emotions that come up. Behavioral, examples of behavioral would be shutting down, right? Becoming immobilized, getting triggered, and a defense mechanism kicking in, which shuts us down. Or maybe I can't tolerate it, so I leave the room. Another behavioral piece that we talk about frequently is when we white folks have the desire to jump to action. We're uncomfortable, and this doesn't feel good. I don't know what to do about it, but we need to do something because I need to make this go away. So the idea is that our work, and what we keep calling building the capacity of white people to do this type of work, is around these ideas of these emotional triggers and these defense mechanisms. So this practicing the skills piece, so how do we practice skills in unlearning white conditioning? How do we practice skills? And this is where the contemplative practice comes in, which Karen will talk to you about in a minute. How do we practice noticing that we're having this emotional response, noticing when a defense mechanism might be kicking in, and how do we manage those triggers so that we don't lash out emotionally, behaviorally with some sort of intellectual argument. So what we did in terms of the work is, this is where the contemplative practice comes in. How do we build awareness about what's going on inside of us as well as what's going on around us? And then the other piece that was so essential was that we were doing this in the context of a group. So participants were having the experience of practicing talking about whiteness and racism with each other, right? We were all practicing that together.
Should we move to the next slide, Michelle?
Yes.
So I'll say a little bit about, in the pilot, how we utilize the role of contemplative practice. And again, this is something that also the Untraining uses contemplative practice in their work on unlearning white liberal racism. But I want to say a little bit about some of the research about how contemplative practice or mindfulness practice can be useful regarding addressing issues of race. So you see here a quote from Deborah Orr, where she talks about, it's a particular book around anti-oppressive pedagogies. She says that it's valuable because the insight that contemplative practice is useful because people reify bionistic That's not easy to say. Binary concepts of self, gender, and race, and a host of other categories which they hold on to. And then we become deeply attached. And so then we assign the opposite term to another. So for me, the simplest example is how deeply folks hold on to the idea that I'm not racist. I could not have done that, because there's an either or that's set up in our thinking. And the truth is, it's more complicated than that. We live in a society where racism is, the analogy is frequently used about it's in the air we breathe. And so how do we actually unlearn what we've been taught, whether it's through media, through family, through conversations that we're hearing in the political sphere these days? That's a lot that permeates without our awareness of it. So then how do we address that? It's not as simple as good person, bad person. Luke and Gibson in particular have done research where they have found that brief mindfulness meditation can reduce implicit age and race bias. So they found that even doing 10 minutes of meditation a day can reduce racial bias in particular. And I also like to share a quote from Arthur Zajonik, who has written about contemplative and transformative pedagogy. Contemplative practice works on the human psyche to shape attention into a far suppler instrument, one that can appreciate a wide range of worldviews and even sustain the paradoxes of life, ultimately drawing life's complexity into a gentle, non-judgmental awareness. So I want to say that we're not proposing in any way that you can meditate your way out of a racist reality, but that this is, again, as Michelle spoke to, the ability to build the internal capacity to examine racism while holding our wholeness at the same time. Rhonda McGee, in her article that I referred to earlier about the way of color insight, talks about how mindfulness is a foundational tool to support effective teaching and learning in diverse settings. It increases focus, concentration, understanding, again, builds our capacity for emotional regulation, perspective taking, and compassion, again, as Zajonik referred to, and can, heal embodied life trauma. Rhonda just completed a mindfulness-based stress reduction course within the Western edition with community partners as well. Again, that was working with a diverse group, with a little bit different setup than what we did, specifically working with white identified faculty and staff to address issues of race. So in our research, we found that participants reported that the contemplative practice helped them build their internal capacity. And we'll have quotes also from our research findings later in this slide presentation, but I want to read a few of them to you. One person reported, "I think it's important," meaning the contemplative practice, "because it gets people to really think about why and who and what and where, and help them get a better understanding of where their ideas might come from, and it affords them the opportunity to decide, what do you want to do with this?" So in our series, we talked a lot about triggers and how something can hit us, particularly around race, and then we respond immediately. So that spaciousness, and again, it's hard for me to describe without making this gesture, allows us a moment to take a breath and think about, was this racist? Where did this come from? How is this related to the teaching or the training or the assumptions that I have, rather than a knee-jerk reaction. Another person wrote or said in our interviews, "I think it's essential, and I think it's what's going to help on a personal level. It's what helps me stay in the work. It's what helps me feel connected to the possibility of change in myself. It allows me not to sink into what I think is of a self-indulgent inactivity. So the remainder of that sense of goodness that we are sort of born with, and that's much bigger than us. And during a time when there's so much separation and trying to find ways to stay connected to myself and then other people who are different than me, it's a great resource, and I integrate it into my classes and my own life." So we had many participants talk about how contemplative practice is part of their teaching now, or it's part of their personal life. And I also want to recognize University of San Francisco is a Jesuit institution. So there were participants who said contemplative practice makes perfect sense to me because I already have a contemplative practice as a practicing Catholic. And so they were able to see the connection between this aspect of our pedagogical approach and what they were already living, how they were living Jesuit values. So some folks did speak to how the contemplative practice for them was a given. So let me click through to the next slide here.
So the other component to this was the importance of community building. And we know about this from the literature as well as our own experiences. So I have a couple of quotes that I want to read to you from the research we did. So 2 participants, one said, I came to this group to learn and to connect with other people who want to address our places of privilege and be more connected to each other in a process that would help them pay more attention to how it's happening. Another participant stated, so it was certainly a benefit to the experience as well, getting closer with colleagues. I think that's a benefit of programs like that. And a number of other participants commented on this as well, what it meant to be sitting in a typical board meeting with other faculty, having gone through this experience with them, and how it shifted not only their perception of them, but also helped to embolden them in terms of what they felt willing to share, willing to address. And I would like to make a note about this. It was very intentional that we kept this dialogue series small, specifically for this aspect of relationship and community building. We were very intentional about the choice of activities, and that was partly of the use of dyads and triads, so people had an opportunity to go deeper and build relationship and connection. We had a total of 12 people who applied, and so we brought 10 of those in and put the other 2 on a wait list. And I also wanted to note that all of the people in the group did identify as white. And that was a condition of the dialogue series. And Karen and I are so used to doing this work that we sometimes forget to talk about that piece and why we made the choice to focus on working solely with white faculty and staff. And the literature refers to this concept as caucusing. And the idea behind caucusing is that white people, in this instance, white people get together and are able to talk about experiences with racism and white privilege, able to do all of these pieces around building the awareness, knowledge, and skills in the context of working together, and it changes the dynamic. So the idea is, if we can work together on building these skills, then we are more equipped to have conversations, to engage in cross-racial dialogues. But part of this is about, we need to do the work on ourselves, with ourselves. And sometimes people get confused about that. Like, why would white people be talking about this if there weren't people of color in the room? But that's exactly the notion that we are trying to challenge, that it is actually on us to do this work with each other, to help us build the capacity to do it with others.
So I'm we have 2 slides that provide an overview of a sample week from the Reflecting on Whiteness series. And I just want to do a quick time check. It's 12:36 here in San Francisco. So we'll keep moving. We've got a little more time here. So this is a highlight, an excerpt from week 2. So we talked about white racial identity development, white fragility, and telling our stories. So more concretely, we had the optional reading of White Fragility by D'Angelo. We handed out an overview sheet that's a one-page cheat sheet that highlighted a few things. We did the multidimensionality exercise, which is the meditation exercise we used every single week in the series, with possibly the exception of the closing session where we did a group of reflection and report out. Michelle provided an overview of white racial identity development. And so every week we would have knowledge, awareness, and skills that we were highlighting. And you can see how those resources and references, as well as the group discussion activity, falls into those categories. So we talked about backlash, we talked in relationship to white fragility, we talked about storytelling. Let me click to the next slide, because then you'll see a little bit of how that happened minute by minute. So every week we started with food and small talk, again, building community, and also we're asking folks to stay for 3 hours after work, a traditional work day, but which is not, of course, what we all follow, but stay for 3 hours talking about race. So let's nourish folks and feed them and build community over food. So folks would settle in, grab some dinner, greet each other. Then we would do the multidimensionality exercise. In this particular week, we talked more about contemplative practice, because again, it was the second week we had gathered, so we wanted to explain why that was an element of this dialogue series. Then we moved into white racial identity, white fragility. So you can see that's not a huge amount of time. And we'll talk more about things that informed our approach. But again, just to name it, we're working in academia, and the temptation is to fall into the intellectual understanding with sharing readings and spending all of our time about how much do we understand about race and racism and all the great readings that we all know, when we're actually trying to drop into the emotional aspect of it too, right? And so the default, particularly in the academy, can be, because folks, our intellectual insight is what we trade in, right? So we moved into small group personal stories related to white identity development and asked folks to apply white identity development to their own personal stories and share that with folks in small groups. Then folks reported out, and then we talked a little bit about backlash or vulnerability hangovers, which is sort of one of the responses we can have after sharing these very personal stories, particularly in a work setting, right? It's a little more vulnerable than, say, going to a weekend workshop with strangers you don't see again. So we wanted to address that too.
So we move through telling you a little bit about the associated research with this pilot project. And I'll go through some of these quotes pretty quickly because I want to make sure we have enough time for the Q&A. Basically, the study consisted of follow-up interviews with all of the participants, which took place 4 to 6 months after the dialogue series completed. They were 1-hour semi-structured interviews and really focused on participants' experiences since the dialogue series. So part of what we wanted to talk about were some of the themes that came up and some of the highlights for our findings. So after we analyzed the data, we discovered that 80% of the participants indicated that there were benefits of contemplative practice. 70% of them endorsed having some institutional fear. And so I have a couple of quotes to highlight what that means. So there's a fear in our leadership. They're not really willing to rock the boat or to make things happen. Another participant said, the workshop was eye-opening to me about the power at the university and the power of the importance of whether people like you or not and how they perceive you and how powerful that is. And again, this isn't specific to USF or that different from other institutions, but we did want to notice that people had an increased awareness about this. 80% of them critiqued the concept of living the mission. So as a social justice institution, we use the term living the mission with regularity. And one participant said, there is a ton of racism, classism, etc., that we need to confront if we're really going to live out our mission. And it just needs to be a part of that. Another participant said, I'm disappointed that the idea of the Jesuit mission is really just sort of a hollow facade and not being lived out by the people who have the means to make that a real thing, a real cultural shift. 70% endorse challenging bias or white privilege, and we're going to give some example of that when we talk about skills later. 70% endorse institutional impact of white privilege, and 90% of the participants talked about the cost of racism to white people. And again, not in any way comparable to the cost of racism to people of color, but they did talk about some of the issues that they would consider to be costs to them because of the racist society we live in. A couple of examples. I think the cost for me is where I feel that I'm set apart from people in a way that is often distancing and painful, but it's very real. The costs are to my own humanity and the cost of lessening the quality of my interactions with people. Another person said, it creates barriers to dialogue and openness and experience around race and culture. It limited my perspective on the world and ideas and values in many ways, growing up in very white-centric circles, especially when I was younger, and in a lot of those circles around different views and values. And another striking finding was that 100% of our participants described having negative emotional responses connected to engaging in racial justice work. And so this goes back to what we were talking about with D'Angelo and the emotional triggers piece, right? And also what we know about going through a white racial identity development process, that there are lots of uncomfortable, challenging, negative emotions that arise. And that's part of what we're focusing on, building the capacity to help us to deal with those emotions. So these are some of the emotions that participants identified, and we didn't even ask them about this. It just came out as they were talking about the work. So hurtful, anger-producing, painful, tension, fear and horror, sadness and guilt, and shame. So next up, we're going to go through a few slides and we broke the data down into categories again around awareness, knowledge, and skills. So increased awareness. So this really showed up around the awareness of the impact of race on personal and professional relationships. It also showed up around looking at how racism exists in both individual and institutional contexts. And participants also noted how they have a new awareness of how they had previously avoided topics of race, or they've seen other people to do that. So one example of a quote from a participant about awareness, she was talking about Lent coming up and how she was really working on incorporating racial justice readings as part of her Lent. So this time of year, Lent being the liturgical season, I'm reading about white privilege, reading about white anti-racism work, reflecting on my role. So I feel that I have awareness that were just set aflame last fall. Another couple of examples, again, it came out both as professional examples and personal examples. So a professional example, I'm paying a lot more attention to how my department is dealing with students. And I'm noticing and we're looking for disparities in how we're all interacting with white students and students of color. Another participant said, with regard to personal awareness, whereas before I thought that it was good enough to be a good person and be an ally and not do harm, but I'm realizing that I am doing harm by not swimming in my sea of personal whiteness and dealing with what that really means, because I didn't want to touch it before. So, a couple other examples of participants' quotes. When you first presented this in the workshop, it wasn't on my radar at all. White racial identity development, how that's a part of racism. Whiteness is the other side of racism. My whole perspective on that has changed. So these are a couple of examples around awareness. And again, I'm going to move through this because of time. The second piece was around knowledge and asking participants questions to determine whether they had increased knowledge. So one participant says, I think about the knowledge about the far-reaching tendrils of privilege, of white privilege and supremacy, being both more conscious of that institutionally, but also beyond the institution. Other participants reported taking on additional reading as well as conversations they were engaging in to support ongoing learning about individual and systemic racism. And another couple of quotes about knowledge. This seminar gave me language and understanding and a deeper awareness of how a particular decision could be interpreted by people who were white versus people who were not white, and how the white experience is so ingrained that it is normative and neutral. And this seminar helped me to understand that it's not normative and neutral. So let's see here. We'll turn to the skills portion. And so skills, again, we're thinking about how does this show up practically in the day-to-day lives. So participants are building awareness, both within themselves and what they're seeing. We were hoping that they got some additional knowledge from the workshop. And then what are they doing in their day-to-day lives? Has anything changed? So one example one of the themes that arose was about addressing inequality. And one participant provided examples of times when they had talked to upper administrators about white identity and stated to their supervisor there was an issue, a conflict. And this person said, there are things we can't understand about this because we are both white. We have to realize that as two white people, we cannot make this decision. Other participants reported about participating in conversations with colleagues about how white behaviors were influencing the experiences of faculty and staff in their department. A couple more quotes. Professionally, I have learned and am practicing how to raise these issues around diversity and challenging the notion that all people see more or less the same way, which is the white way of seeing things. So to challenge that a little bit. Another participant said, the group helped me raise questions of privilege in my work environment. And so on some level, it was empowering. I continue to maybe name the elephant in the room and just be straightforward about it. Well, I'm white and this means this, or being more straightforward in conversations, is the example she gave.
Before I talk a little bit about the benefits of contemplative practice, I want to say that also we had asked people specifically if this was coming up, if race or racism was coming up in their personal or professional lives when they shared these examples. And a number of folks, and just mention this because the election is 1 week away, and this was last spring, a number of folks mentioned that given the current climate politically, certainly race and racism were coming up. So I'll go into the benefits of contemplative practice in some of the quotes and excerpts that we have from our transcripts. And again, I pull up this swimming in my sea of personal whiteness. And one of the things about the knowledge, skills, and awareness is that sometimes they move back and forth. It's both a knowledge and an awareness. So internal action. It's essential. Internal action is essential. And I think it's what helps me on a personal level. And I referred to this quote earlier. It's what helps me stay in the work. It's what helps me feel connected to the possibility of change in myself that allows me not to sink into self-indulgent inactivity. So again, the ability to see hope really is what I hear, connected to the possibility of change in oneself, right? So again, it's moving away from that dualistic thinking that Sajonic and others were writing about, or Deborah Orr's writing about anti-oppressive pedagogies. What the mindfulness piece opened up for me was that I can have those two realities exist, that I can have things about myself that I'm wildly uncomfortable with and don't like, but I can still own the good parts and know that I'm a good person and a compassionate person. I have to hold these two things at the same time. Otherwise, I'll hide or I won't do the work. By being compassionate to myself while still holding the things I want to fix, it allows me to be more compassionate in working with other people. I think this relates to our work with communities. It works to those of us who work in centers for public service, this can come up, as well as conversations with students. And I think going back to the examples where folks were talking about racism institutionally, recognizing we are part of the institution. And so how are we changing the institution by how we're engaging in conversations about race and not simply othering people around these. And so the contemplative practice can cultivate this internal action and this internal change. And we'll talk a little bit about that more. So we're going to talk about future directions and questions, but we also have some slides with a few of our takeaways. But, we're left with these questions about how can we, big questions, juicy questions that will carry forward. How can we shift the paradigm in academia? What if the goal that we actually have is building the capacity to sit with uncertainty? And again, in the age of assessment, then how does one measure that? In a setting where vulnerability is often interpreted as weakness, can we turn the tables and view vulnerability as strength? And then how do we acknowledge what we don't know and make room for non-dominant voices to be heard and valued? So I'll read an excerpt from some of the writing Michelle and I are doing that reflects some of these questions. One of the greatest challenges to institutional level discussions on privilege and oppression is the centering of what we know. This work seeks to challenge that paradigm, suggesting that it is more important to be curious about what we do not know and take responsibility to own our gap areas in understanding. In a university setting, this can be a radical act, challenging the dominant paradigm of the academy. The potential implications are profound. If we center owning what we do not know, it makes room for other voices at the table. It creates space for the voices of students, community partners, activists, as well as staff and faculty of color in the academy. So we wonder, is it possible to build the realization that sitting in the seat of expertise is not actually the goal? Rather, the goal is building the capacity to sit with uncertainty. In a setting where vulnerability is often interpreted as weakness, we'd like to turn the tables, acknowledging vulnerability as a strength, and most importantly, a condition for anyone wanting to work towards social justice. This frame has the potential of shifting the paradigm in academia, acknowledging what we do not know, thereby making room for non-dominant voices to be heard and valued. And I think our colleague who said pointedly in the meeting, we can't make this decision because we don't actually know enough. Just their given lived experience was not going to inform their ability to answer the questions that were before them regarding race on campus. Michelle, do you want to say a little bit about Michelle Alexander's quote?
So this came out in September 16th on social media when she announced that she was leaving the legal field to join the Union Theological Seminary. And she writes, "This is not simply a legal problem or a political problem or a policy problem. At its core, America's journey from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration raises profound moral and spiritual questions about who we are, individually and collectively, who we aim to become, and what we are willing to do now." And for us, this was such a beautiful frame around the work that we're trying to do and the values that we hold. So much of the change that needs to happen comes from within us. And oftentimes we're focused on what's out there and what needs to happen and how we're supposed to fix things. And so part of what we were shifting with this dialogue series is bringing some of that back to the internal work.
So we'll talk about a few of our takeaways. Michelle, do you want to talk about the first few here?
Sure, and I think I've said this 3 or 4 times now, and I'll say it again, the importance of institutional support. I think if Karen and I had tried to do this on our own, we would not have had the same turnout, in addition to just the lending of the institutional credibility, which also then we were able to get the Jesuit Foundation grant, and it built from there. The other thing to note is that institutions change when they are ready to. And again, I think it's part of the institutional context that has been building over the last few years at USF that even provided a context where a whiteness workshop like this could take place. 3, again, recognizing that the internal work is change and to be cautious of the desire to jump to action. And that was one theme that came up with our participants is, wanting to take action, wanting to do things because the internal work is uncomfortable. And so part of what we learned in this process is that we have to resist and have to encourage our participants to resist the urge to focus on the intellectual realm, which is challenging in an academic setting because that's what we're supposed to do and that's all we know how to do. So it was quite a radical act to be asking folks to instead turn inward and focus on a more emotional realm. And also just that there isn't a way to do this perfectly. And so for us, we really knew that it was about making mistakes and we were going to try. That's why we keep calling it a pilot. And we learned a lot in doing it. And I imagine we will continue to learn as we continue to try new models.
So a couple more takeaways. 1, co-facilitate with someone you trust. This content is messy. And so the ability to be vulnerable in co-facilitation and then have the ability to stop and regroup every week is key. We're very lucky to co-facilitate with Michelle and build our professional and personal relationship through this process. Preparation is key. That includes internal preparation for facilitators. So we actually did a contemplative practice before each class session as a means to get grounded, to enter into conversations about race ourselves. So whatever preparation looks like, I think many of us who are educators, we know that we know the content, but what it comes down to is whether or not we're actually grounded in ourselves when we walk into the classroom. So that's true for this work as well. Flexibility is key. Just assume that things will be different than you expect. Be flexible and revise weekly. We have the syllabus that we used in fall of 2017. It'll be revised when we do this again. And then every week we would meet probably for at least 2 hours. I know we set aside 2-hour chunks of time and then sometimes more than that to prepare for the Tuesday night gathering. So flex it and revise based on what had happened with our participants the week before. Resistance will show up. Someone or some ones will get angry, frustrated, or resistant. Be compassionate with yourself and others. Talking about race is difficult. Folks get frustrated. Folks want to move to action immediately because they're sick of what things are like. That's understandable. And then also, as I have said before in other settings, we're talking with folks about race, and we're sort of poking at this topic, and it is sort of, honestly, I feel like it's inevitable. Folks will turn on the facilitators and become frustrated with the facilitators around how we're talking about race, because those emotions are in the room when we're talking about race. And then number 5 is be aware of the good white person phenomenon. There are no experts. We encourage you to respect your own process, recognize that you're in a process. Michelle and I will always disclaim that we are not experts in this. We are simply engaged in this, and that we learn every time we do it. And then the other thing is that one thing that we've talked about in other circles is this desire to look like a good white person. So reflect on, why am I doing this and what's my motivation? Don't beat yourself up for it, but then understand, is this about looking like a good or a down white person? Because that's a slippery slope too, that many of us have fallen into at different points in our lives. So here's our conference. I'm sorry, I just read a note about the pre-conference in Denver. Make a note. I'm sure that Elaine and Piper can provide more information on that. So we'll be in Denver for a pre-conference session. This is our contact information. I want to say thanks to everybody so much for participating, and I think we're going to go to questions after this. We have about 15 more minutes. Michelle, did you have any closing thoughts?
No, thank you all for participating. I'm curious to hear your questions. And actually, I think I can start with, there was one question that was posed in the chat. So the question was there anything uncomfortable emotionally and or logistically about excluding people of color? Karen, do you want to address that, or would you like me to?
I'm sorry, could you start? Because I was catching up on the chat. I'd had it closed.
Sure. So the question is, was there anything uncomfortable emotionally and or logistically about excluding people of color?
My personal response would be no, because I did caucuses, breakout caucuses, actually back when I was teaching Introduction to Service and Multicultural Communities back at Monterey Bay in the late 90s, and participated in caucuses as a student as well. So I think we made it clear this was for white identified folks. I mean, some of it could be the setting that we are in the Bay Area, we're in San Francisco, so it is not uncommon for folks to be in conversations around race where folks want to do the work they need to do with each other. And frankly, I think my experience is that folks of color recognize that white people have work to do and those conversations are different. And sometimes those conversations can be painful for people of color to hear, because how many times do you want to engage in a racism 101 conversation? That for me was not uncomfortable, and we did not face any logistical challenges. We did not actually, my experience and recollection is I didn't actually have to explain that to anyone. Folks understood this is white people working with white people, which is something that's necessary for change around race.
And I'll just add, I do think it's related to the institutional context, and Karen went over that in the beginning. There's been a build-up. There's been more of a conversation, even in the last 5 years that I've been at the university. We're talking about race and privilege in a different way now than we were before. And a big piece of that is work on faculty and staff, and the work of again, the Vice Provost of the Diversity and Engagement Office, who has really shifted the climate. I can see it. It's very palpable now. And so I think all of those pieces had to be in place in order for us to do this. I don't think that 10 years ago it would have gone smoothly in the same way. This campus is ready for it. Okay, a couple other questions have come up. The gender makeup of the group. So we had 9 participants, self-identified as female, and then we had 1 male participant, which, for us, we had hoped to have more of a mix, and it's who applied this round. Another question, any recommendations on how one might start bringing up white privilege with college students? I have brought it up in class and students are immediately turned off. Are there curriculums or ideas? So I think there are a lot of resources out there. I would encourage you to check out the CATS book, the White Awareness. It's a manual in a sense, and it has lots of different activities about talking to people about privilege. And I think that's a great place to start because there are a lot of activities. There's also teaching for social justice. I think the hardest part is, finding the place to bring it in. Particularly, I don't know what subject you're teaching, but we have syllabi and we have class plans and we have so much material that we need to cover, and then something comes up in the classroom around race, and we need to stop and address it, or there's an opportunity to address it or to bring it in or to highlight privilege in a different way. And how do we make the space for that? And that's part of what Karen and I learned even in doing this dialogue series is about the flexibility. We may have a great plan for how the night's going to go, and then it changes drastically. And can we roll with that to prioritize the process and the work in the room? I would just say to keep trying, and I think students are all in different places as well. So it's really about figuring out, where they are in terms of their awareness about it all and how to best intervene based on that, which is tricky. It's just challenging. It really is. Let's see, do we have any other questions? I think we answered.
If anyone else wants to type some questions into the Q&A box or into the chat box, preferably a Q&A. So thank you for somebody who just posted something. I'm going to just say that I put into the chat box a link to the Continuums of Service conference that Karen has kindly referenced, where Karen and Michelle will be doing a pre-conference. So you can copy that link or click on that link to go to the Continuums of Service conference. And I believe that their pre-conference is already listed up there, although registration hasn't opened yet for this conference.
Thank you. Karen, can you see this question? I think it's a good one for you.
Sorry, I'm having a hard time.
Here, I'll just read it. Did you explore the intersection of whiteness and service learning at all, critical service learning, or was this not even a consideration?
I think it's a consideration in the fact that I was one of the co-facilitators, and so in the research it was not a question. Because we had participants from all over campus and not everyone was doing service learning or community engaged learning. Certainly in the facilitation of the dialogue series, I shared about it and talked about my own thoughts on being a white woman who directs a campus community partnership with the Western Addition that has a significant African American population. So I talked about that with I would say a fair amount of transparency around how that was part of my journey and part of what I was examining right now professionally. So if you're asking specifically if we did any of the readings around critical service learning, like the Mitchell article or anything else, we didn't. But I know my colleague Star Plaxton Moore covers that in the faculty service learning seminar.
Yeah, and if anyone is interested, what Karen's referring to, do a search for Tania Mitchell and critical service learning, and you will find that article, which is a great place to start if that's a new topic for you.
I would also, this is Alexis from Utah Campus Compact, I would also recommend the article that Tania Mitchell wrote with Dave Donahue, who's now at University of San Francisco, and Courtney Younglaw about service learning being a pedagogy of whiteness as a companion piece to the critical service learning article.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Are there any other questions? Sorry about that.
So while we wait, and in case there's any last questions that come in, so we did record this. So in, I believe, about a week's time, on the Campus Compact of the Mountain West, where you were able to sign up for this webinar, you will be able to go back and find some of the resources, slide presentation, which I'm answering for Zara right now. You'll be able to get the PowerPoint slides. I'm looking at Michelle, yes. And the audio recording. It won't be up for at least a week. So but for sure within the next 2 weeks, it should be up there. And you can always contact me if you're in California, if you're not seeing it and you need it. And then immediately after this webinar is done, you'll probably receive directly in your inbox. If you're the person who registered for this, you will see an evaluation, because we'd love to get any feedback from you on the webinar, this specific webinar, as well as any future topics that you'd like us to cover. So, not wanting to waste folks' time. Alexis, can I turn it over to you? I don't know if you have any closing.
Sure. Hello. Just really quickly, sorry, I have this over here, but I want to look at the camera. Just again, thank you so much for your time. As Elaine mentioned, we'll be putting the recording up. Campus Compact of the Mountain West has a YouTube channel, as well as a link should be up on their website. And we do encourage you, if you have not yet considered it, to come to the Continuums of Service Western Region Campus Compact Conference, which will be in April in Denver. And you can click on the link that Elaine provided for that. There are other pre-conferences that will also be wonderful, as well as a whole slew of sessions that I think will be of great interest to anyone in our field. So we look forward to seeing you there, hopefully. Thank you so much.
And we do want to thank Michelle and Karen. Thank you so much. It was really great that you worked with us to provide this content. I think a lot of folks are going to, it's just a really important topic, and both kudos to you for taking it on your campus to have the dialogues with folks, and we look forward to hearing more as you continue your work with folks. So thank you everyone for participating, and we'll go ahead and stop the recording and end the webinar now.